The moment I finally said no, every conversation at the Thanksgiving table stopped. But that did not happen right away. In fact, if you had walked into my house that morning, you probably would have thought everything looked perfect. The dining table was beautifully decorated. The turkey was already in the oven. Fresh rolls were rising beneath a kitchen towel. Pumpkin pies cooled on the counter beside bowls of whipped cream. It was the first Thanksgiving Daniel and I were hosting in our new home, and I had spent nearly a month preparing for it. I remember standing in the kitchen at 7 o'clock that morning holding a cup of coffee and looking around with a sense of pride. We had purchased the house 8 months earlier after years of saving. It was not enormous, but it was ours. Every room reflected choices Daniel and I had made together. Every piece of furniture had a story behind it. Most importantly, it finally felt like home. Thanksgiving was supposed to be the first major family gathering in that home. I wanted everything to be special. I wanted our relatives to feel welcome. I wanted everyone to create happy memories together. Looking back now, I realize I spent far more energy worrying about everyone else's comfort than my own. Around 9 o'clock, Daniel came downstairs and wrapped his arms around me while I checked recipes on my phone. "Everything smells amazing," he said. I smiled. "That is because I have been cooking since dawn." He laughed. "Worth it." For a few minutes, I allowed myself to enjoy the moment. Then the front doorbell rang. Daniel glanced at the clock. "Mom is early." My stomach tightened slightly. Margaret Collins had a habit of arriving early. Very early. Sometimes an hour early. Sometimes 2. She always claimed she was trying to help. Unfortunately, her version of helping rarely felt helpful. Daniel opened the door while I stayed in the kitchen. A moment later, Margaret's voice filled the house. "I knew it. I knew you would need me." I closed my eyes briefly. Not because she had done anything terrible. Not yet. It was simply the familiar certainty in her voice. The certainty that suggested every situation naturally required her supervision. Margaret walked into the kitchen carrying 2 large casserole dishes. She set them on the counter and immediately began looking around. Not admiring. Inspecting. "Oh," she said. "You moved the serving table." "Yes," I replied. "It works better near the dining room." Margaret tilted her head. "Interesting choice." Then she opened a cabinet without asking. "Where are the larger platters?" I took a slow breath. "I already have everything organized." She smiled politely. "Of course you do." Then she continued searching anyway. Within 10 minutes of arriving, she had repositioned 3 serving bowls, moved a stack of plates, and suggested changing the seating arrangement. I reminded myself to stay calm. After all, Thanksgiving had not even started yet. Family members would arrive soon. There was no reason to create tension. Daniel seemed unaware of any problem. He carried boxes from the garage while chatting casually with his mother. Meanwhile, I found myself quietly fixing small changes Margaret made whenever her back was turned. At one point, I arranged place cards around the dining table exactly the way I wanted them. 20 minutes later, I returned to find them completely rearranged. Margaret looked pleased with herself. "This flows better." I stared at the table. I had already assigned seats. She waved a hand dismissively. "Trust me. This works. Trust me." I had heard those words for years. Trust me about holidays. Trust me about finances. Trust me about marriage advice. Trust me about household decisions. Somewhere along the way, I realized trust me usually meant do it my way. As noon approached and relatives began arriving, the house filled with laughter and conversation. On the surface, everything looked wonderful. Yet standing in my own kitchen, watching Margaret confidently direct people around a gathering I had spent weeks planning, I experienced a feeling that had become far too familiar. It felt as though I was slowly disappearing from a celebration that was supposed to belong to me. And although I did not know it yet, Thanksgiving Day was only beginning. As the afternoon continued, I found myself noticing something I had spent years trying to ignore. Margaret's behavior did not begin when she walked into my new house that morning. It had been present long before Thanksgiving, long before Daniel and I bought our home, long before we were married. The difference was that I could no longer pretend it was harmless. Watching her move confidently through my kitchen, directing relatives and making decisions without asking, brought back memories I had not thought about in a long time. When Daniel and I got engaged, Margaret had insisted on helping with the wedding planning. At first, I appreciated the offer. Weddings are expensive and stressful. Extra support seemed like a blessing. Then the suggestions became instructions. The instructions became expectations. Before I realized what was happening, Margaret had strong opinions about the venue, the flowers, the guest list, and even the music. Every time I pushed back, she would smile and say the same thing. "I am only trying to help." Somehow those words always made me feel guilty for wanting my own preferences. A few years later, when Daniel and I rented our first apartment, the pattern repeated itself. Margaret arrived carrying boxes and decorating ideas. She questioned where furniture should go. She suggested different paint colors. She even rearranged items after I had already unpacked them. Daniel laughed about it at the time. "That is just mom being mom." Back then I laughed too. It seemed easier than explaining why it bothered me. Standing in the kitchen now, I watched Margaret instruct one of Daniel's cousins where to place serving trays. The cousin followed her directions automatically. Nobody questioned it. Nobody seemed surprised. That realization hit me harder than I expected. Margaret had spent years establishing herself as the person who made decisions. The family had grown accustomed to it. In many situations, people simply stepped aside and let her take over. The problem was that she no longer seemed capable of recognizing situations where the decisions were not hers to make. Around 1 o'clock, I carried a tray of appetizers into the living room. Several relatives complimented the decorations and thanked me for hosting. Their kindness lifted my spirits. Then Margaret walked into the room carrying a bowl of stuffing. "Everything turned out beautifully," one aunt said. Before I could respond, Margaret smiled proudly. "We worked very hard on it." The word landed harder than it should have. I knew she probably meant it casually. Yet something about it bothered me. I had spent weeks planning menus, shopping for ingredients, cleaning the house, organizing seating, preparing recipes. Margaret had arrived a few hours earlier and somehow transformed herself into a co-host. Once again I said nothing. The older I got, the more I realized how often women are praised for being agreeable, for keeping the peace, for avoiding conflict. Somewhere along the way, I had become very good at swallowing frustration. The trouble with swallowed frustration is that it does not disappear. It accumulates. By mid-afternoon, the house was full. Laughter echoed through every room. Football played quietly on the television. Children ran through hallways carrying paper turkeys they had colored earlier. From the outside, it looked like a perfect family holiday. Yet beneath the surface, I felt increasingly disconnected from my own celebration. At one point, I walked into the dining room and found Margaret explaining the seating arrangement to arriving guests. The seating arrangement she had changed without asking me. People listened politely and took their assigned places. Nobody knew I had originally planned something different. Nobody knew I was standing there wondering why I felt like a visitor in my own home. Later, Daniel found me alone in the kitchen refilling drink pitchers. "You okay?" he asked. I forced a smile. "Of course." He studied me for a moment. "You seem tired." I laughed softly. "Hosting 20 people will do that." He nodded and kissed my forehead before returning to the living room. The conversation lasted less than a minute, but after he left, I found myself staring out the kitchen window. Part of me wished I had told him the truth. The truth was that I was tired. Not from cooking. Not from cleaning. Not from hosting. I was tired of constantly making room for someone else's authority. And for the first time in years, a small voice inside me began asking a question I had never seriously considered before. What would happen if I stopped making room for it at all? As dinner time approached, the energy inside the house shifted. The casual conversations and relaxed laughter of the afternoon slowly gave way to the organized chaos that always happens before a large family meal. People drifted toward the dining room. Children were called away from games. Someone turned down the television. Plates began appearing on counters. Serving dishes lined every available surface in the kitchen. This should have been my favorite part of the day. It was the moment when all the preparation finally came together. Instead, I felt strangely disconnected from it. The feeling grew stronger when I walked into the kitchen and discovered Margaret directing traffic, as though she were managing an event staff. "The sweet potatoes go over there," she told one cousin. "Put the gravy beside the turkey." Then she pointed toward another relative. "No, not that table. Use the sideboard." Nobody questioned her. They simply followed instructions. I stood quietly for a moment watching the scene unfold. What struck me was not that Margaret was helping. It was that nobody seemed to realize she was making decisions that were never hers to make. The line between helping and taking over had become completely invisible. A few minutes later, I opened the refrigerator to retrieve a cranberry salad I had prepared the night before. It was gone. Confused, I searched every shelf. Finally, I found it sitting on a side counter. Margaret noticed my expression immediately. "I moved it." "Why?" I asked. She smiled. It did not really match the rest of the presentation. For a moment, I simply stared at her. The salad had belonged to a recipe my grandmother taught me years earlier. I made it every Thanksgiving. It was not just another dish. It was a tradition. Margaret seemed completely unaware of why her decision bothered me. Or perhaps she simply assumed her judgment outweighed mine. "I liked where it was," I said carefully. She shrugged. "Trust me. This looks better." There were those words again. Trust me. The phrase that somehow ended every discussion before it even began. I picked up the bowl and quietly returned it to the refrigerator shelf where I had originally planned to place it later. Margaret watched but said nothing. The moment was small, insignificant to everyone else. Yet something inside me shifted. For years, I had treated these moments as isolated incidents, tiny annoyances, personality differences. Now I was beginning to see them as something larger. Each individual event was minor. Together they formed a pattern that touched nearly every important part of my life. Shortly afterward, several relatives gathered around the kitchen island complimenting the food. One uncle smiled at Margaret. "You always know how to put together a great Thanksgiving." Margaret laughed modestly. "Well, somebody has to keep things organized." Several people chuckled. Nobody meant any harm. Yet once again the assumption settled naturally into the room. Margaret was the organizer. Margaret was the authority. Margaret was the reason everything worked. I glanced at Daniel. He did not appear to notice anything unusual. Why would he? This had been the family dynamic for decades. To him it probably looked normal. To me it felt increasingly difficult to ignore. As the meal drew closer, I carried serving dishes into the dining room and placed them exactly where I wanted them. 10 minutes later, I returned to find half of them rearranged. This time I did not need to ask who had done it. Margaret stood nearby adjusting silverware. I looked at the table. Then I looked at her. She smiled pleasantly. The flow works better this way. Something remarkable happened in that moment. For the first time all day, I did not immediately question myself. I did not wonder whether I was being overly sensitive. I did not search for excuses. Instead, I simply felt tired. Tired of constantly adapting. Tired of constantly yielding. Tired of treating my own preferences as less important in order to avoid discomfort. Across the room, family members continued chatting happily. The scent of turkey and roasted vegetables filled the air. Holiday music played softly from a speaker in the corner. Everything looked warm and festive. Yet standing beside that dining table, I realized I was approaching a limit I had never acknowledged before. Not a dramatic breaking point. Not an explosion of anger. Something quieter. More important. The growing realization that keeping peace at any cost eventually comes with a cost of its own. And for the first time, I began wondering whether I had already paid too much. I carried the last serving platter into the dining room and forced myself to smile. The table looked beautiful. Candles flickered softly between autumn centerpieces. Crystal glasses reflected warm light from the chandelier overhead. 20 family members filled the room with conversation and laughter. Anyone looking from the outside would have seen a perfect holiday gathering. Yet beneath the surface, I felt a growing sense of frustration that refused to disappear. As everyone settled into their seats, I noticed something else. Several guests were complimenting Margaret on details she had not planned. One cousin admired the table decorations. Another praised the menu. An uncle commented on how organized everything seemed. Each time, Margaret accepted the praise graciously. She never directly claimed credit. She simply never corrected anyone either. "Thank you," she would say with a warm smile. "We worked hard on it." That word appeared again. We. I looked around the room. The decorations had been chosen by me. The menu had been created by me. The shopping, preparation, cooking, and planning had been done by me. Yet somehow the story of the day was slowly changing in real time. The more people spoke, the more Margaret seemed to become the unofficial host of an event she had not organized. I tried to ignore it. I truly did. But the situation became harder to overlook when dinner finally began. Daniel stood and thanked everyone for coming. Then he raised a glass. "I want to thank Emily for everything she did to make today happen." Relief washed through me. For a moment I felt seen. Several relatives applauded lightly. A few smiled in my direction. Before I could respond, Margaret laughed. She definitely needed some help. The comment sounded harmless. Enough that several people chuckled. Yet I felt something tighten inside my chest. Daniel hesitated briefly before continuing. The conversation moved on. Nobody seemed bothered. Nobody except me. Throughout dinner, similar moments kept appearing. A relative asked where a recipe came from. Margaret answered before I could. Someone complimented the turkey. Margaret explained how she would have cooked it differently. An aunt praised the seating arrangement. Margaret described how she had improved it earlier in the day. None of the comments were openly rude. That was part of what made them so difficult to challenge. Every individual remark sounded reasonable. Together they created a completely different message. The message was that Margaret remained the expert while I remained the student. Around halfway through the meal, I excused myself and stepped into the kitchen to collect dessert plates. The silence felt wonderful after hours of smiling. A few moments later, Daniel followed me. "Everything okay?" he asked. I stared at the counter while arranging plates. "Do you ever notice how often your mother speaks for me?" Daniel frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" I laughed quietly. Not because anything was funny, because the question itself felt familiar. "Whenever someone asks me something," she answers. "Whenever I make a decision, she adjusts it. Whenever someone compliments something, she somehow becomes part of the story." Daniel leaned against the counter. "I do not think she means anything by it." There it was. The explanation I had heard for years. She does not mean anything by it. I knew Daniel was trying to help. He genuinely believed he was calming the situation. Instead, his response made me feel more alone. "Intentions are not really the issue anymore," I said softly. He looked confused. Before he could reply, voices from the dining room interrupted us. Someone was asking where dessert was. Daniel returned to the table while I remained in the kitchen for a few extra seconds. As I stood there alone, another memory surfaced unexpectedly. A conversation I had once shared with my grandmother years earlier. She had told me something I did not fully understand at the time. People treat you the way you teach them to treat you. Back then the advice seemed simple. Standing in my kitchen now, it felt profound. Because the uncomfortable truth was that I had spent years teaching everyone around me that my boundaries were optional. Every time I stayed silent, every time I laughed something off, every time I chose comfort over honesty, I reinforced the same lesson. The realization was not empowering. It was painful. Yet it also felt strangely freeing. If patterns can be taught, perhaps they can be changed. I picked up the dessert plates and returned to the dining room. The holiday celebration continued around me. Family members laughed. Children shared stories. The aroma of pumpkin pie filled the air. But something inside me had shifted. For the first time, I was no longer focused on Margaret's behavior alone. I was beginning to understand my own role in allowing it to continue. And that realization would prove far more important than anything that had happened so far. I carried dessert into the dining room and placed the pies on the sideboard, while conversations continued around me. Most people seemed completely unaware of the internal battle I had been fighting all day. They saw a successful family gathering. They saw a table full of food and relatives enjoying themselves. They did not see the years of accumulated frustration sitting quietly behind my smile. As coffee was poured and dessert plates were passed around, I found myself sitting beside Aunt Linda, one of Daniel's older relatives. She was in her 70s, sharp-witted, observant, and famous for noticing things other people missed. For years, she had been one of the few people in the family who never seemed intimidated by Margaret's personality. We chatted casually for a few minutes about the house, the weather, and holiday travel plans. Then she surprised me. "You look tired," she said quietly. I laughed. "Hosting 20 people will do that." She smiled knowingly. "That is not what I meant." Her words caught me off guard. For a moment I considered giving the polite answer, the safe answer. Instead, I found myself telling the truth. Not all of it. Just enough. I mentioned the rearranged table settings, the constant corrections, the feeling that nothing I did ever seemed fully mine. Aunt Linda listened without interrupting. When I finished, she stirred her coffee slowly and nodded. "You know what your problem is?" I blinked. "That sounds encouraging." She laughed softly. "Your problem is that you are too kind." I immediately shook my head. I do not think kindness is the problem. It is when kindness turns into permission. The sentence landed with surprising force. I remained silent. Aunt Linda continued. "Margaret has always been a strong personality. She likes being in charge. She likes being needed." She paused. "But people forget something important. Strong personalities keep expanding until they find a boundary." I stared at my coffee cup. What if setting a boundary creates conflict? She smiled. Then the conflict was already there. For several seconds, I simply sat there processing her words. The more I thought about them, the more accurate they felt. I had spent years believing that silence preserved peace. Yet if I was being honest with myself, I had not felt peaceful in a very long time. I felt resentful, frustrated, invisible. Those emotions had been growing quietly beneath the surface while I convinced myself everything was fine. Across the room, Margaret was laughing with several relatives while describing a holiday dinner from years ago. Everyone listened attentively. She looked completely comfortable occupying the center of attention. Watching her, I suddenly realized something else. Margaret probably believed everything was fine too. Why would she not? Nobody had ever clearly told her otherwise. Not Daniel. Not the family. Certainly not me. We had all adapted ourselves around her behavior instead of addressing it directly. Aunt Linda seemed to read my thoughts. "People are not mind readers, Emily." I nodded slowly. "I know." Then eventually somebody has to speak. The conversation stayed with me long after it ended. As the evening continued, I found myself paying attention to things I normally ignored. Every time Margaret interrupted someone, every time she answered a question that was not directed at her, every time she adjusted something that did not need adjusting, none of it felt malicious, yet none of it felt respectful either. Most importantly, I noticed my own reactions. For years, those moments triggered guilt. Tonight, they triggered clarity. Around 7 o'clock, family members began discussing plans for Christmas. Several people shared ideas about hosting responsibilities and travel arrangements. Before long, Margaret naturally started organizing details. The familiar pattern unfolded right in front of me. Suggestions became decisions. Decisions became expectations. Everyone adjusted accordingly. Except this time something felt different. For the first time, I was no longer automatically participating in the pattern. I was observing it, understanding it, recognizing it. The realization brought an unexpected sense of calm. Not because the situation had improved, because confusion had disappeared. I finally understood why I felt the way I did. The issue was never a centerpiece, never a seating chart, never a bowl of cranberry salad. The issue was that I had spent years surrendering small pieces of my voice in exchange for temporary comfort. And somewhere along the way, those small pieces added up to something much larger. As dessert plates emptied and conversations continued around the table, I felt a quiet decision beginning to form inside me. It was not anger. It was not rebellion. It was simply the growing understanding that kindness and self-respect were not opposites. For the first time all day, I found myself wondering what would happen if I finally acted like that was true. As the evening moved on, the dining room settled into the comfortable rhythm that follows a large holiday meal. Empty dessert plates sat scattered across the table. Coffee cups were refilled. Conversations drifted between family memories, future plans, and stories people had told so many times that everyone knew the endings before they arrived. On the surface, everything appeared warm and peaceful. Yet beneath that familiar comfort, I could feel something changing inside me. It was not anger. In fact, I felt calmer than I had all day. The conversation with Aunt Linda had given me something I had been missing for years. Clarity. Once you clearly see a pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee it. A little later, several relatives gathered in the living room while others remained around the dining table. I was collecting empty cups when I overheard a conversation about Christmas. One cousin mentioned hosting a family brunch. Another suggested exchanging recipes ahead of time. The discussion was casual and friendly. Then, almost automatically, Margaret stepped into the center of it. "What we should do is rotate responsibilities differently this year," she announced. Several people turned toward her. "I have already thought about a better system." Nobody had asked her to create a system. Nobody had suggested there was a problem. Yet within seconds she was outlining schedules, assigning responsibilities, and describing how things should work. As I listened, I noticed something surprising. A few relatives exchanged glances. One uncle looked mildly uncomfortable. Another cousin stared down into her coffee. For years, I assumed I was the only one who noticed these moments. Suddenly, I was not so sure. Perhaps everyone saw them. Perhaps they simply responded the same way I always had, by staying quiet. The realization stayed with me as I carried dishes into the kitchen. A few minutes later, Daniel joined me again. He opened the dishwasher while I rinsed plates. "Aunt Linda seems to have adopted you tonight," he joked. I smiled. "She gave me some interesting advice. Should I be worried?" I laughed softly. "Probably not." He smiled and returned to stacking dishes. For a moment, I considered telling him everything I was thinking. Then I stopped myself. Not because I wanted to hide it, because I was still processing it myself. Some realizations arrive slowly. They need time to settle before they can be shared. When we returned to the dining room, the Christmas conversation was still happening. Margaret was now discussing menu ideas. One relative mentioned bringing a dessert. Another offered to host a gathering. Before long, Margaret had opinions about every detail. Then something happened that perfectly captured the dynamic I had been struggling to describe all day. A younger cousin mentioned wanting to host a small brunch at her own home. She sounded excited, proud. Margaret smiled politely. "That is sweet." Then she immediately began explaining how she would organize it differently. I watched the cousin's face fall ever so slightly. The excitement vanished. Not dramatically, just enough to notice if you were paying attention. And suddenly I saw myself. Not today. Not this year. Over the past decade. The countless moments when my enthusiasm quietly shrank to make room for someone else's certainty. The countless times I adjusted my plans because challenging them seemed more exhausting than accepting them. Across the room, Aunt Linda caught my eye. She did not say anything. She simply raised an eyebrow slightly, as though asking whether I had noticed. I had, more clearly than ever before. The evening continued. Family members laughed. Children played board games on the floor. Someone turned on holiday music. Yet underneath it all, I felt a growing sense of resolve. Not the kind that appears suddenly, the kind that builds after years of experience, years of observation, years of swallowing words that should have been spoken. For most of my life, I believed that avoiding discomfort was the same thing as maintaining harmony. Now I was beginning to understand that real harmony requires honesty. Otherwise, all you create is silence. Around 8 o'clock, as another conversation began forming around the dining table, Margaret leaned back in her chair and confidently started discussing plans that involved my home, my schedule, and my future holiday gatherings as though those decisions already belonged to her. Several relatives listened politely. Daniel remained distracted by another discussion nearby. And for the first time all day, I felt the moment approaching. Not because I planned it. Not because I wanted conflict. Because eventually every pattern reaches a point where continuing it becomes harder than changing it. And sitting there beneath the warm glow of Thanksgiving lights, surrounded by family, I realized I was getting very close to that point. The moment arrived so quietly that nobody noticed it at first. One minute the family was laughing over coffee and pie. The next minute, a single conversation shifted the entire evening. Margaret was sitting at the head of the dining table, surrounded by relatives who were discussing future family gatherings. Christmas plans had evolved into conversations about birthdays, summer barbecues, and next year's holidays. I listened quietly while clearing a few empty plates. Then Margaret smiled and made an announcement that sounded perfectly reasonable on the surface. "Next Thanksgiving will be much easier," she said confidently. Several relatives looked toward her. "Now that Emily has had practice, I can take over the planning earlier and help her avoid some of the mistakes from this year." A few people laughed politely. My hands froze around a stack of plates. The room remained cheerful, casual, comfortable. Yet something about those words landed differently than everything that had come before. Maybe it was because I had spent the entire day watching the same pattern repeat itself. Maybe it was because of my conversation with Aunt Linda. Maybe it was because I was finally exhausted from carrying the weight of unspoken frustration. Whatever the reason, I felt something inside me become perfectly clear. Margaret continued speaking. "I already have a few ideas for improving the menu." She smiled. "And the seating arrangement definitely needs adjustment." More polite laughter followed. Then she looked directly at me. "Do not worry. I will help you organize it properly next time." The sentence hung in the air. For years I would have smiled, nodded, changed the subject, found some polite way to avoid discomfort. Instead, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. Not anger, not resentment. Calm. The kind of calm that arrives when you finally stop arguing with yourself. I set the plates down on the sideboard and looked at Margaret. My voice was steady when I spoke. No. The word was not loud. It was not dramatic. Yet every conversation in the room immediately stopped. Forks paused. Coffee cups remained suspended halfway to people's lips. 20 relatives suddenly found something far more interesting than dessert. Margaret blinked. "What?" For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. She genuinely seemed confused, as though the possibility of hearing that word had never occurred to her. I smiled politely. "No. I will be organizing it myself." Silence. Complete silence. Margaret laughed awkwardly. "Emily, I was only trying to help." Normally that sentence would have worked. Normally it would have pushed me back into the familiar cycle of apologizing for my own feelings. This time it did not. "I know," I said gently, "but I want to do it myself." Margaret stared at me. "You seem upset." "I am not upset." And surprisingly, it was true. I just want to make my own decisions about my own home. The room remained completely still. Across the table, Aunt Linda lowered her coffee cup with the faintest hint of a smile. Margaret looked genuinely uncomfortable now. "I do not understand why this is becoming an issue." The old version of me would have retreated right there. The old version of me would have rushed to reassure everyone. Instead, I took a slow breath. Because I should have said it years ago. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. For the first time in my life, every person in that room was listening to me. "I appreciate your help," I continued. "I appreciate everything you do for this family. But sometimes helping turns into deciding. And sometimes deciding turns into taking over." Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it again. The words seemed to catch her completely off guard. I kept my voice calm. "This is my home. My event. My choices. I am happy to ask for advice when I need it. But I need you to let me make my own decisions." The silence that followed felt enormous. Then something unexpected happened. Daniel spoke. "She is right." Every head turned toward him. Daniel looked at his mother. "Mom, Emily is right." There was no anger in his voice. No accusation. Just honesty. "You mean well. But sometimes you step in before anyone asks you to." Margaret stared at him as though she could not believe what she was hearing. For years, Daniel had avoided these moments. For years, he had tried to keep everyone comfortable. Now he was finally saying what needed to be said. The room remained quiet. But for the first time all day, the silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt honest. And sitting there surrounded by family, I realized that the hardest word I had ever spoken had only 2 letters. Yet somehow it felt powerful enough to change everything. For several seconds after Daniel spoke, nobody said a word. The room felt suspended in time. The holiday music continued softly in the background. A child laughed somewhere in the living room. completely unaware that something important had just happened. Around the table, relatives exchanged uncertain glances. They were waiting to see what would happen next. So was I. Margaret looked from Daniel to me and then back again. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed genuinely unsure of herself. That uncertainty made me realize something I had never fully understood before. Margaret was not used to being challenged because almost nobody ever challenged her. The confidence she carried so naturally had been reinforced for decades. Family members adapted. Friends accommodated. Relatives stayed quiet, including me. Her certainty had not appeared out of nowhere. It had grown in an environment where very few people ever pushed back. Finally, Margaret cleared her throat. I was only trying to make things easier. Her voice sounded softer now, less authoritative, more vulnerable. I nodded. I know. And I meant it. Despite everything that had happened, I truly believed she was trying to help. The problem was never her intention. The problem was that her idea of helping often left no room for anyone else's choices. Margaret looked down at her coffee cup. I never realized you felt this way. The honesty in her voice surprised me. For years I had imagined this conversation ending in an argument. I imagined defensiveness, denial, accusations. Instead, what I saw sitting across from me was a woman who genuinely seemed caught off guard. That realization softened something inside me. That is because I never said anything, I admitted. Aunt Linda nodded slightly from across the table. Margaret looked back at me. Why not? I laughed quietly. Because I did not want to hurt anyone's feelings. A few relatives smiled knowingly. Apparently I was not the only person familiar with that instinct. Margaret remained silent for a moment. Then she surprised everyone. You should have told me. The room stayed quiet. Not tense this time. Thoughtful. Reflective. Daniel reached over and squeezed my hand beneath the table. It was a small gesture, but it meant more than he probably realized. For years I had carried this frustration alone. Now I was no longer carrying it by myself. The conversation slowly continued. Not immediately. Not smoothly. But it continued. A cousin changed the subject briefly. Someone refilled coffee. Another relative made a joke that earned a few relieved laughs. The evening gradually found its rhythm again. Yet something fundamental had changed. The change was not dramatic. Nobody stormed out. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody was humiliated. Instead, the truth had simply entered the room. Once that happened, pretending became impossible. Later that evening, as guests began collecting coats and leftovers, Margaret approached me while I packed containers in the kitchen. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she sighed. You really worked hard today. I smiled. Thank you. She glanced around the kitchen. Everything turned out beautifully. Under normal circumstances, the compliment might have sounded ordinary. Tonight it felt different. There was no hidden correction attached to it. No suggestion. No improvement. Just acknowledgement. I appreciate that, I said. Margaret nodded. Then she hesitated before speaking again. I suppose I have a habit of stepping in. I laughed softly. A little. To my surprise, she laughed too. Not defensively. Honestly. Your father-in-law used to tell me the same thing. We both smiled. It was probably the most genuine conversation we had ever shared. Not because every issue had been solved. Because for once neither of us was pretending. When the last guests finally left and the house grew quiet, Daniel and I stood together in the kitchen surrounded by empty platters and half-finished pies. Exhaustion settled over both of us. Yet beneath the exhaustion was something else. Relief. Daniel rapped. An arm around my shoulders. I should have said something sooner. I looked at him. Maybe. He nodded. Definitely. We both laughed. Then his expression became serious. I am proud of you. The words caught me off guard. Not because they were dramatic. Because they were sincere. I looked around the house we had worked so hard to build. The same house where I had spent most of the day feeling invisible. Now it felt different. Nothing physical had changed. The furniture remained the same. The decorations remained the same. Yet somehow the entire space felt lighter. More like mine. More like ours. As I turned off the dining room lights and prepared for bed, I realized the most important thing about the day had nothing to do with Thanksgiving dinner. It had nothing to do with family traditions or holiday planning. The most important thing was that for the first time in years, I had spoken honestly without apologizing for it. And instead of destroying peace, the truth had finally given it a chance to exist. The months that followed surprised me more than Thanksgiving itself. For years, I believed that speaking honestly would create permanent damage. I imagined resentment, distance, endless family tension. Instead, what happened was far less dramatic and far more meaningful. Life continued. December arrived. Christmas decorations appeared in neighborhood windows. Snow dusted rooftops a few times before melting by afternoon. Families gathered. Traditions continued. The world did not fall apart because I had finally spoken a simple truth. In fact, something unexpected happened. Margaret changed. Not overnight. Not perfectly. But noticeably. The first sign appeared a few weeks after Thanksgiving when she called me one Saturday morning. Normally, those conversations involved advice, suggestions, or plans she had already created. This time was different. "I wanted to ask you something," she said. The sentence alone caught my attention. Ask. Not tell. Not suggest. Ask. "What is it?" I replied. "I was thinking about hosting a small family brunch after Christmas. Would that work for you and Daniel?" Such a simple question. Yet I almost laughed when I heard it. For years, the decision would have been presented as a completed plan. Now she was actually seeking input. I answered honestly. We discussed schedules. We talked like two adults instead of one person making decisions for another. When I hung up the phone, I realized how much I appreciated that small change. Respect rarely arrives through grand gestures. It usually appears through ordinary moments handled differently. Daniel noticed the changes too. One evening while we were cleaning up after dinner, he looked at me and said, "Things feel different." I nodded. "They do." He smiled. "Better." I considered the question. Healthier. That seemed like the right word. Not perfect. Healthy. Because healthy relationships still have disagreements. Healthy relationships still require effort. The difference is that healthy relationships leave room for everyone's voice. As winter turned into spring, I discovered something else. Setting a boundary with Margaret had quietly changed other parts of my life too. I found myself speaking up more often at work. I found myself expressing opinions without immediately second-guessing them. I found myself making decisions with greater confidence. It was as though one honest conversation had unlocked something that had been waiting inside me for years. Looking back, I realized the real transformation was not Margaret's. It was mine. The boundary had not changed who I was. It had simply allowed me to become more fully myself. By summer, family gatherings felt noticeably different. Margaret still had opinions. She was still organized, still energetic, still very much Margaret. The difference was that she no longer assumed her opinions automatically became decisions. And when she occasionally slipped into old habits, something else had changed. I no longer felt powerless. I knew how to speak. I knew how to respond. The fear that once kept me silent had disappeared. One afternoon during a family barbecue, Aunt Linda pulled me aside. "How are things?" she asked with a knowing smile. I laughed. "Much better." She nodded. "Funny how that works." "What is?" "The moment you stop avoiding discomfort, everything gets easier." I smiled because she was right. The conversation we shared at Thanksgiving had changed my life more than she probably realized. Then autumn arrived once again. Before I knew it, another holiday season was approaching. 1 year after the dinner that had changed everything, Daniel and I prepared to host family again. The house looked familiar. The decorations returned. The recipes returned. Even the same cranberry salad sat waiting in the refrigerator. Yet I felt completely different. On Thanksgiving morning, the doorbell rang. Daniel opened the door. Margaret stepped inside carrying a casserole dish. She looked around and smiled. "Tell me where you would like me to put this." I stared at her for a second. Then I smiled back. "The kitchen counter is perfect." She nodded and carried it exactly where I suggested. "No corrections. No adjustments. No rearranging. Just respect." Later that evening, as family filled the dining room once again, I looked around the table and felt something I had not felt the year before. Peace. Real peace. Not the fragile kind built on silence. Not the exhausting kind built on sacrifice. The kind built on honesty. The kind built on mutual respect. The kind that allows everyone to belong. As conversations flowed around me and laughter filled the room, I caught Margaret's eye from across the table. She smiled warmly. I smiled back. And in that simple moment, I realized the most important lesson I had learned. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can say is not something cruel, not something dramatic, not something that tears people apart. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can say is a calm and respectful no, because the right boundary does not destroy relationships. It gives them the chance to become stronger than they have ever been before.